Why so many fat kids take up the tuba?
That's a great opener. We're live. Welcome to the Lovecraft Easing podcast.
Oh my God.
And I've just lost a lot of viewers with that comment.
Almost all of them. Yeah, no.
Now, yes, let's try to remember that if all goes well today, this is my podcast. If it all goes to hell, John Langan is temporarily taking over. So
Think of me as Nero.
yeah, that's exactly how I think of you all the time.
Burn it all. Burn it down.
Exactly. Not Neo, Nero.
You need to go for the neck beard, just straight neck beard.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Was that the Peter Ustinov version?
So those of you who are watching live, just give me a comment. Let me know that we're coming through. You can see us and hear us. And so I'm bearing the lead because we're interviewing Christopher Buehlman today. Hey, man. Good to see you.
Hey, good to see you guys.
What kind of weather were you driving through? You stopped at a hotel, you said.
Yeah, the weather down by in Massachusetts got pretty hairy there for a bit, and we got some traffic, so I got slowed down quite a bit, and I honestly left later than I wanted to as well. So it was not an ideal travel day, but you know, my wife went to school here in Troy, and I visited her back when we were just dating a long time ago. And I really didn't see it properly because it was absolutely blanketed by this white material that seemed to have dampened sound and hidden all cars. It was very
I
strange.
don't know what that is, but yeah.
I'm thinking that could be some form of industrial pollution if it's Troy. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
spider webs.
Yeah.
We were talking about this with Kelly on the last episode.
Spiders all the way down.
Yeah.
You had to deal with this material with shovels, and it was grueling. So I thought I'd see it now when the spider attack's not happening.
Did she go to RPI or Russell Sage?
I'm not sure.
Well, RPI would have been if she was like an engineering major.
She's
And
not. No,
Russell
no.
Sage would have been if she's a humanities major.
Yeah. Do you know, it may well be, it was a long time ago. It may well be that her, and we weren't dating seriously yet. I just came up to see her here. I'm not sure.
It's in the distant past.
It is.
Your story is starting to crumble, Buehlman. Already.
And he's losing points with his wife. He doesn't remember where. If she's watching live, she's like, "Screw that guy." Can't remember where I went to college.
Yeah.
She's not watching.
He says with
at the bar.
He says with weary resignation.
Well, anyway, welcome, man. It's always good to see you. You've been on before. And let's do introductions real quick. And before that, let me just say that your publishing company sent me an email a while back about the Daughters' War, and I love your work. I think that, and I've told you this, and I've said it independently when you haven't been on the show. There are so many, for example, vampire novels out there, you know, but the Suicide Motors Club, The Lesser Dead, for those of you, and I know you're out there because that's pretty much the people who watch this show. If you're into that kind of thing, if you're into vampires, if you're into horror, this is they're very original novels and very well done novels. And I've read them both several times. So pick those up. I first heard of Christopher, of all things, not anyone emailing me, but several years ago, we were shopping at Walmart, and I tend to stay out of my wife's way when I do that. So I went to headed immediately to the books section,
Smart
and
man.
yeah, and those across the river was on the shelf. I was like, wow, this looks really, really interesting, and that's how I've gotten to know you. So from there,
Cool.
yeah. So let's do introductions, and then we all knew it was coming. John's been trying to do this for years. Take over the show, so I'm going to give it to him today. Oh, I didn't finish my story. So when your publisher emailed me, I said to all these guys in an email, I said, I love Buehlman. I really want to support him. I'm just not a big fantasy guy. I read his horror stuff. And John chimed in. I got it. I'll take over. So that's why we're doing it
Fair.
this way. There you go.
Yeah.
So anyway, Mike Davis, temporarily not in charge of the Lovecraft Easing podcast. John, for those who are listening, let's do introductions and can't see us. So
Hi, I'm John Langan. I'm a writer and a high school teacher, and Christopher Buehlman's #1 fan.
I don't know. I think he's got a lot of them. Matt was talking about him nonstop.
He was,
before he
yeah.
even-
But who else is going to kidnap him and tie him to a bed and make him write the sequel to The Black Tongue Thief?
And you're not far away right now from him.
That's right.
Exactly.
Still want to have eggs in
Exactly.
the morning?
Dirty
Yeah.
birdie, you dirty birdie.
Matt,
Hi, I'm Matt Carpenter. I run Lovecraft Easy Movie Night, which is mostly every Saturday. I just want to say one thing about the movie we watched last night. So we've talked before about how most exorcism movies rely on Catholic iconography, except the old ways used Aztec methods for an exorcism. Well, we just watched The Medium from Thailand, and essentially it's an exorcism movie using Thai mysticism. It was really, oh man, what a ride.
Wow.
that's good to know.
It's
Yeah,
good-
yeah.
It's on Netflix.
That's the one that goes bad, right? Really bad?
It did not go well for any people involved, shall we say.
Okay.
Okay.
Ben,
My name is Ben Handelman. According to Kelly Young, our previous guest, I'm now taking over as the show drunk, which I feel judged and hurt. He was insulting me for having a beer before noon, and I just want everyone to know how old Kelly is now. And he's sitting in a rocking chair somewhere drinking more.
I don't think there's
He's
anything
one-
wrong with it. So I'm not going to judge you.
Kelly was judging me even after I left such glowing reviews of his book.
It's the way he is.
I may not be Chris Buellen's biggest fan, but I'm like the second biggest behind Langan, so I just want to throw that out there.
He's going to
As
help
far
me
as
to.
I'm-
He's going to help
Wait
me
a
to
second.
tie Buehlman down. Yeah.
If we're deciding who's the biggest fan, are we going by mass?
Is that another fat joke?
Oh,
Is that
I've-
two
I've
fat jokes in a row?
definitely-
like fourth thing
Oh,
behind
man.
all of you guys. So
I've definitely got you guys. Yeah,
Buehlman's like,
that's-
oh, I remember what it's like to be on this show.
no,
now.
I'm way down in weight, but I will say I have been reading The Daughter's
been a
Word. It's
while.
really amazing. So I'll have more to say later, but it's pretty great.
Hey,
I just have
hey.
this I have this vision of Kelly Young as like one of the Bartles and James guys. He's just sitting on, like, no, never mind. Now Langan's judging me. He's like, yeah, that was a bad joke. I'm Pete Rollick. I don't drink as much as I used to.
But
Got him.
apparently,
You
a
got-
lot of it is Bartles and James. Yeah.
It is.
You have a book coming in the next 7 to 10 days.
I have a
Ooh.
new book coming out in the next 7 to 10 days. It's a kid's book if your kids are like,
Is this your first kid's book?
it is.
I
If
think
your
so,
kids
yeah.
are like members of the Manson family, this is for you.
There you go.
No, it's sort of like the elevator pitch is Children of the Damned meets Red Dawn as a golden book. So,
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
yeah.
It's good. I've read it.
Cute little Wolverine.
Yeah.
Hey, Chris, I don't imagine could be any, but in case there is someone listening later or maybe just coming to you lately, could you introduce yourself and talk
Yeah,
about yourself for a minute?
Sure. Yeah. I'm Christopher Buehlman. I'm a horror and fantasy writer, also playwright, poet, and comedian. I've done comedy shows at Renaissance festivals for a long time, although I'm kind of semi-retired from that gig. Yeah, and I'm here currently enjoying the metropolis that is Troy, New York. There it is. There it is. Be jealous.
That's a quality curtain. I love it.
Yeah. I wasn't gonna make it too clear so people could GPS me and stuff. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's too late. John's already on it, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we've got you right down. Yeah, the sat nav. Yeah, the SEAL Team 6 is moving in.
Anyway, John, in all seriousness, I very much want to support anything that Christopher does. So yeah, thank you for doing the interview today, and everybody else chime in as as you feel moved to do so. So, John, take it away.
So, Chris.
John.
So, yeah, these books are crazy, man, in all the best possible ways. And you know, on the one hand, like reading them, I was thinking to myself, well, there's kind of, it feels like there's a connection between what you're doing here and Between Two Fires, right?
Mm.
But you know what? Maybe before I get into any of that, how would you describe these books to anyone in the audience who hasn't read them? Because I, you know, immediately I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to go in with all sorts of deep cuts. But you know what? Let's presume that there's someone who's just tuning in to see Mike Davis. They have no idea who you
Yeah.
are.
Uh-huh.
I mean, your wife, right? And you're, you know, how would you describe these two books?
Well, these are the first two fantasy novels by a horror guy. So they've definitely got dark undertones. There are strong dystopian elements running through both of them. I'd say that with the first book, it is, you know, a lot of people talk about it as being grimdark, and I suppose that's possibly fair because the world is grimdark. But they're both first-person narratives, and the first book is narrated by a scoundrel, and a cad who's kind of a funny fucker, and he's got a lot of gallows humor, and he doesn't let his incredibly dark world get him down, really. Yeah. And in the second book, I didn't know if I was going to let Galva narrate it, but I went through a lot of other permutations. It is told by somebody who's very different. It is instead of being a humor forward book, it is more of a heart forward book because it's told by somebody who's speaking very earnestly and vulnerably about a very difficult time. Although she's metal as fuck, she's a complete hard ass, but she's able to share some of her earlier fear. Oh, I'm doing a little more of a deep dive than a quick pitch. Anyway, yeah, there you go.
Okay, so the you know, In the World of the Black Tongue Thief, and I am taking these books as, you know, let's talk about Black Tongue Thief, then let's talk about the Daughter's War, because that's the order you've published them in. Or do you, you know, is that fair? Is it like a sort of a Star Wars thing where you're like, no, we should actually watch the prequel trilogy first, and then, you know, how do you is that moving backwards and forwards in time something you would like a reader to do, or you know,
I want,
what's your
yeah, I wrote this prequel wanting it to be something that could stand alone. So it's pretty much a choose your own adventure. A reader can just decide if they want to dive in with the, you know, parlous thief, or if they want to go with the stoic, badass paladin, and it's entirely up to them where they start.
Right, right. Okay, so how do you start then? Like as I said, you know, like what I was thinking about is Between Two Fires, which is like this brilliant medieval quest horror novel, right? Seems as if it's in the background of these, as if, you know, when you were writing that, did you think to yourself, oh yeah, maybe I could go a little further with this in the out and out fantasy direction, or no relation whatsoever, and it was just something you always wanted to do? Or how did you get to this place as a writer?
Yeah, great question. Well, if you look at the track after Between Two Fires, the next thing I wrote was a contemporary thing, The Necromancer's House, and then I went for two more recent historical novels set in the 60s and 70s. So I did not go from Between Two Fires thinking I will now trek toward fantasy. The pivot to fantasy, actually, there was a commercial element to it. I'll be perfectly honest, because Between Two Fires itself did not do well when it came out. It was a sophomore effort. Those Across the River was, financially speaking, a base hit. I needed another base hit to move my career forward, and it was sort of a foul ball. It just didn't sell. People didn't know what it was about. Hardly anybody reviewed it. Hardly anybody bought it, and it sort of tanked my horror career, honestly. Um, And I had been told, you know, that was a possibility by my very savvy editor at Penguin, Tom Colgan. He was like, you know, this is set in medieval France, and it's a kind of a hybrid thing. It doesn't have an easy hook. This might be a challenging book for people. And I was like, man, it's what I want to write. I feel passionately about it. I want to do it. And they supported me. But damn if he wasn't right, at least in the short term. So yeah, when, you know, perfect, you know, a perfect illustration of this is that Those Across the River had a print run, I think, initial print run of 50, I think 50,000. But by the time, I don't know what Between Two Fires did, but by the time we get to Necromancer's House, it was 9,000 because nobody was buying it. So it honestly never had a chance. Nobody saw it. Nobody saw it. Nobody saw the vampire books, really. And then, you know, Penguin was bought out by Random House, and things changed there. And my agent said, you know, I think it might be time to rebrand you. Is there another genre you enjoy? And I said, fantasy. She said, do you want to write a fantasy book? And I thought about it, and I said, yeah, I kind of do. Let's try it. And that's how I got there.
So why this particular fantasy then, right? So you're like, okay, I'm going to do fantasy. There's a lot of different ways that fantasy can go. Did you? I mean, you've got a map. I love a book with a map, right? You know,
Yeah.
like I'm constantly sort of flipping back and forward. Where is this? Where, you know? But like, did the map come first? You know, did you doodle a map, or was it just you? You know, how did you? Because yeah, I'm stumbling a bit for the exact right way to phrase this, but
Yeah,
how did you come to this particular fantasy setting?
right. Much the same way I come to any story, you know, like I knew I wanted to write a medieval something when I wrote Between Two Fires. So I just kind of thought about things that were interesting to me, and I decided I would write a little short story exercise, just as an exercise to get things moving. And it was about a little girl who approaches a bunch of brigands in a barn and asks for help burying her plague dead dad, right? And that actually becomes the very first chapter of Between Two Fires. Likewise, after a couple of false starts and I wrote a couple of things I didn't care for. I decided to write about a thieves guild thief who's now a highwayman. Doesn't really want to be, but he's waiting in ambush, and here comes this badass down the road, and he's got a bad feeling about ambushing this person, but the leader of his little group says we're doing it, so they do it, and they get their ass kicked. And that, you know, became the first chapter of Black Tongue, although there were some changes, because in that first version it was third person, and it was a lot more grimdark. It was just dark. And also in the first version of it, the Galva character was a male.
Yeah, that was one of the. I mean, there's a number of. Man, there's so many different ways to go out to follow this. But one of the fascinating things about the book to me was the way that you set up this aftermath world, right? Like so many fantasy novels are set, you know, Tolkien as well, right? They're set in the aftermath of wars that happened sometimes a generation ago, sometimes thousands of years ago. But we're living in the aftermath of something. And so one of the ways that the aftermath plays out in the Black Tongue Thief is that we have this gender disparity, this profound gender disparity, which allows you to be you know, to put women in positions that they might not normally be in a you know, realistic fantasy, whatever the fuck that anyway. But you have a naturalistic explanation for that isn't going to like cause all the nerds to lose their minds, right? So
It's mainly the incels, not the nerds, who
yeah,
get upset.
I'm sorry, incels.
Don't
For
be.
so many reasons.
Don't
So
be.
sorry.
So many reasons, right? But so you set up and you know the way that you portray the goblins as well. I'm sort of bouncing around a little bit here, but I'm thinking about the way that you know you take the goblins, you know, Tolkien's orcs, right, have become, and those types of characters have become like these problematic figures for us, right? But for you know, in your context, these are these alien things that are not necessarily evil. so much as just they treat people like provender. They're just they don't think of us as beings in the same way they see themselves as beings, and therefore they can do whatever they want, you know. So
I
yeah,
got
you oh go ahead.
I gotta say I was fascinated. I haven't, like I said, I haven't read The Daughters War. I was fascinated by the goblins, about how they originated. And one of the things that just keeps getting me is that hook they have on their arm. Do you know what I mean? That scene where they grab the guy and he sinks his hook into the forearm, and like that, how could that have originated naturally? You know, it's like, and it makes me wonder where they came from and what had happened to them. And so I'm wondering where you're going to go with that. I'm just fascinated.
I don't always believe that everything that is interesting needs an answer.
Oh, I know, but it's just
Yeah, no, it's cool. It's cool, but yeah, I haven't necessarily thought a lot about sort of the evolution of that, although I have done a lot of thinking about goblins as a naturalistic species. I wanted very much to avoid the third rail of making these things what other people might interpret to be some specific human ethnicity or race or religion. I wanted none of that. So I was very careful to imbue these things with an extremely individual biology and culture that to the best of my knowledge has no reference to any human culture or group that I'm aware of.
Yeah, they practice a form of what are you going to call it, germ warfare, or they're able to do things to the humans and to the human population that is unusual in a fantasy kind of a setting. So so what I guess, you know, like thieves are always fun,
Yeah.
oh, Lady Hawk, right? Matthew Broderick's character, right? But thieves are always fun because they can exist in the margins, right? They can go all kinds of places that people who are either explicitly peasants or explicitly nobility can't go. They're able to cross those borders. So a thief certainly makes sense in lots of ways, right? And a thief who has a literal burden, a literal financial burden placed on him, which gets him slapped um, by whoever wants to, is but also, and also that burden is put on him. And there's something really brilliant about the way you do that with the for his education, he's saddled with student loans he can never repay. And these allow anybody who wants to just come up and smack him because they see this little tattoo on his face, right? So he has this constant need to keep making money, right? To keep, he can't walk away from his obligation. So he has this considerable education, but he is literally paying for it all the time, right? And then he intersects with another invasion story, I guess you might say. Another kind of incursion kind of a story that's happening. Um, how did you, you know, I don't know, I guess talk us through that. Talk us through how um you found the voice for that character. Okay, he ambushes the badass, but the badass survives. Well, let's see where the badass is going, right? Let's put them together. That makes sense in a narrative kind of way. How then does the world and let's call it the plot spin out from that?
Wow. Yeah, it's actually it's been now 8 years since I did all that. It was about 2016 when I first began sketching all of those things out. So it's honestly getting a little difficult to remember what was chicken and what was egg. Um, I knew that I wanted giants involved fairly early on, like the very first draft. You know, they were going to.
Mhm.
It was giants who had, you know, the goblins were the South's problem and giants were the North's problem.
Right.
Right. And I loved the idea of humankind caught between these. things. Here are the humanoid races. Where are the allied races? Well, if there were elves, and we're not sure if there were, they're extinct. And we have no dwarves or hobbits to speak of. It's just kind, which are either human or very human-like. And these hostile races, one of which eats us and one of which steps on us. But I really don't recall exactly the order in which these things became clear.
Right.
But you've got the nut of it. I mean, I needed to know where this badass was going. I needed to know how the guild was involved with this journey, how Kinch would become part of this journey, and those things all kind of fell together. One thing editors are great at is making you clarify things, because I just love to tell stories. If it was just me on my own, I would be telling the most episodic, nonsensical bullshit as you go from one thing I find interesting to another thing I find interesting.
Have you thought about doing that? I mean, have you thought about writing any stories like set in this world, with either sort of side characters or
yes. Oh yes, I'm very tempted. I definitely feel the weight of wanting to get the sequel out. So I don't want to stop and take any more detours. Tor was kind enough to listen to my plaintive plea that, oh please, I really don't know enough about Galva, and I want to know more about the Goblin Wars, because any words out of her mouth for the sequel are going to become gospel. If I ever want to go back and write a Goblin War book, I've given myself all these parameters I haven't fully thought through. So I said, let me lay down the parameters right now. Let me make Galva more three-dimensional so that I can write about her better when it's mainly just her and Kinch going over the Thrall Mountains. Yeah.
Right. So yeah. So I mean, that was I guess my question, or my sort of next question from there was yeah, the situation for Galva is dire in a different kind of way in the Daughters War. I mean, when the warbirds appear in that opening scene in the Black Tongue Thief, that thing is terrifying. It's your all of your skills as a horror writer come into play in presenting this thing that is just really, really scary. What was I mean, do you remember what the inspiration for that was? Because it's a lot of fun, like we all know the emus and ostriches are really actually kind of frightening birds,
Yeah.
So was what was it that led you to think, nah, I don't want horses, I want birds?
I've always loved corvids. I've always loved ravens and crows, and maybe even blue jays. I mean, I just like them. They're smart. They're fascinating. I'm sure you've seen much of the same information I have about how they can remember our faces and hold varieties and
use of tools and stuff like that.
How they cache things. And I've got one of my best friends has a raven, and Hugin, and she only has one though.
Oh well, that's a problem right there. You've got
They're
thought,
right
but you
there.
don't have memory. Yeah.
Right. As those of us who drink understand this very well. But Hugin's a fascinating bird. He's actually was sort of the direct inspiration for the bird Richu, Sensei Richu, who's a fucker, and Hugin is too. Like what Hugin says most often is "want water," and sometimes he wants water, but sometimes he just wants one of the uninitiated to bring water close to his cage so he can peck their finger, and that's fun for him,
Right.
And they're like that. So why did I make it corvids? As soon as I got the idea, as soon as I sort of thought about what about a big ass corvid, I went, oh shit, that's not been done before. That's interesting. That's the thing. So as soon as I got one mental tentacle on it, I was doing it.
Because then that part of the dynamic, and I think part of what's fascinating I feel like it must have been a challenge for you as a writer is when we go back in time, now we're seeing them introduced.
Yeah.
And now they're this new thing, and don't get me wrong, in the Black Tongue Thief, they're a new thing for us as readers, right? But
Right.
they're part of the world, you know. Now we see them as this brand new thing, and it's like, is this even going to work? Is this, you know, we've
Right.
kind of magicked them into you know, an existence, or magical evolution, is that a thing? But we've
It is in this world,
yeah,
yeah.
we brought them forward to this point. And how do, you know, how do we make that resonant, you know, for a reader? You know, how do you make the reader feel, oh, I don't know if this is really a good idea?
Well, it's clear from the very beginning, from the very introduction of them in Daughter's War, that the bargain is a Faustian one,
Yeah.
because they are hungry. They require an inordinate amount of calories just to be rendered safe to be around humans. And also, you know, they've been trained to kill 3.5 to 4 foot tall things for their entire lives, effectively. So what happens when they're around civilian children?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's messed up, man. So it you know, here you how about this? The
So
daughters.
John, while you're thinking about that, who
Go
was
ahead,
it?
Pete.
John Ringo did something very similar in There Will Be, in his science fantasy series, where someone's in the system that they have human beings have like godlike powers, and then so somebody play acts at being a werewolf, then his ability to no longer be a werewolf is taken away.
Huh.
So
Interesting.
suddenly he is an obligate carnivore living in town. And so it's like, nope, he packs up and he moves 100 miles away because, you know,
Werewolves have to be rural.
yes, and if you can't live with the people you love, you just, no, it's not going to work. So it's very similar to that idea of what you're talking. It's like big predatory animals need lots and lots of calories, and they eat a lot of stuff.
But yes, and going back to what you were saying about the Mike, about the introduction of these things and how they were terrifying. Wait, was that Mike or John who said that? Was that you, John?
If it was
It
brilliant, it
was-
was me. But yeah, we'll go with that.
But I love the idea that they're terrifying. And one of the things that I wanted to get at in the Daughters War, to give us a little relief from the oppressive dominance of the goblins in this war, was the idea that here are monsters, and the Corvids are true fucking monsters, but they're on our side.
Right.
Yeah, I loved that feeling.
Yeah, to both these books, I mean, I found myself thinking, and I'm not as well versed in the fantasy of the last 20 years, say, right, as I might be. But you know, there's this way in which both books feel to me informed by everything post 9/11, post Iraq war, post Afghanistan war. That there's this sense of that, you know, that war is it's a terrible thing, no matter what you see in the, and I love the Lord of the Rings movies, don't get me wrong, but no matter what you see, it's a terrible thing. Horrible things happen. We may have to enlist things on our side that are terrible, that are, in order to help us in our victory. And maybe if I'm trying to remember, does somebody say this in one of the books, that maybe if we had the edge on the goblins, we would be doing the same thing to them?
Mark Lawrence said that in his review about the
Was that
about the Daughters War. He said, I think it was Mark Lawrence. One of the reviews I really enjoyed said, if humans, of course, if the goblins do horrible things, though, of course, if we were a little bit better at killing them, we'd be doing that in their world.
right? We were, yeah.
That was Mark Lawrence, yeah.
Yeah, which seemed to me a trenchant enough point, you know.
Yeah.
But
And to be
I
clear, there's a moment in the Daughters War, like early on, I want to say 50 or 60 pages in, where the humans are doing terrible things to the goblins they've captured. Like it's made clear very early on in the book that the humans are not treating their foes as like this, I mean, the latrines is what I'm thinking of, the way you
I know.
described the way,
I knew what you were thinking of.
yeah, it's pretty bad. And I would even say, like, as much as the Corvids are described as monsters, the way you describe the mages, um, I mean, the first time we see kind of the mages interact, and like the weaker mages are sacrificed, and the bigger mage does something really terrible, and
Yeah.
like maybe is it worth it? I don't know, but like that's kind of the point the book is making. It very much feels I don't want to call it sword and sorcery, but kind of that darker. You mentioned grimdark earlier.
Mhm.
I do very much get some of that feeling. Like this has like an old school 80s Warhammer kind of like, hey, magic's really bad, and we're about to be extinct. That we're down to our last resorts. We're doing anything we can to survive. And I
Yeah.
really
And
thought the Daughters War does a good job of kind of making that clear.
yeah, thanks. And also we've got to remember they've got magic too.
Yeah.
And it's only mentioned briefly when Galva's brother Paul writes a letter to her, but he's talking about the Battle of Orphe, which we heard about in passing in The Black Tongue Thief. The first big defeat, the first of the very large defeats before Golte. In Orphe, a goblin mage created sigils that he sent aloft into the sky that would, when you looked at it, would make you nauseous. So, and faced it towards the human army, so that just before the goblin attack, here's this strange thing in the sky. Everyone looks at it. Everyone who sees it is now puking. And then here comes the attack.
Into their helmets, the way you describe it, it's into their
Yeah.
helmets. They don't even have time to take their helmets off.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they're overwhelmed. And I loved the way even that you described like the goblin mages responding to the weaker mages that are being used as like like
Bait.
decoys.
Yeah.
Bait, right? Like the idea of like like tons of water being forced into someone and causing them to burst, and just the way
So-
you described all those scenes was
Oh yeah, the goblins, the goblins put a lot of their mages on the water. That's just kind of how they roll. Their navy is mage heavy, and you see that in Black Tongue. There's a lesser goblin mage, if you will, that Kinch encounters and the party encounters, who actually puts his thumb on the scale and tilts the battle in the goblins' favor on that island in Black Tongue. But the goblins put their I love the idea that they've got four really powerful magicers on this huge ass dreadnought, and most of their job is manipulating the bronze works on the face of the ship so that these big jaws can open and close, and you hear the sound of tortured metal grinding while this happens. And it's not a machine, it's magicers actually manipulating metal while this is going on, and then it has the big bronze arm that'll come down with a pick and smash the sails or rip the sails or go in and stab the hull under the waterline and sink a ship. The dreadnought's fucked up.
And see, this is why I was saying to everyone before that like this would make like an amazing RPG setting. Like if you license this out and I got like a D&D or RuneQuest or whatever system setting, I would totally love to play this, because it's so the way all of these things are described is we're explaining this to the audience. Like the book is explaining these things in such a, I don't know if realistic is the right term, but like it's first person, and then like she's occasionally sharing letters from like her brother and things like that. It feels alive. This feels like a setting I would love to kind of like play in, so to speak. Like it'd make an amazing RPG or video game or something.
No, and that sense of plausibility is very important to me. And as Mr. Langan knows, when you go and you're going to present fantastical things to your readership, you've got to ground them. You've got to make all the sensory and historical and other details around the fantastical as credible as you can, because you're spending such capital of credibility on getting people to believe that you're talking about, a titan under the earth in Iraq, or werewolves or what have you.
Yeah, I was about to say the same is true for your werewolf book and for both of your vampire books. You read these books and you're there. You're
Yeah.
very good at that.
Thank you. It's important to me. It's the thing I most demand from things that I like to read. So I want to believe it.
Yeah.
I want to believe it. I want to be in it.
Yeah, no, and they certainly, I agree. They certainly read that. I mean, I think all your stuff reads that way. There's something, the way that you combine the fantastic and the mundane. Oh, um, okay, back to the ambush, right? The shield that's made out of the magic wood, not magic, the special wood that will keep growing even after you've crafted it, and that's super valuable. Which obviously it would be super valuable, but there's a kind of economic incentive behind all of this as
Ah,
well.
one of the things I loved about writing The Daughters of War was getting to go back and do deeper dives on shit you see in The Black Tongue Thief. And I think my favorite example of that is that shield. Like, we know in Black Tongue Thief that there are several occasions in which trouble starts because of the shield.
Yeah.
Like she's robbed in the first place. They attempt to rob her in the first place because of the shield. It isn't that she's got a mysterious satchel she's carrying, who could be
Right.
some bullshit in that. It's the shield.
Right.
And when they fight the brigand Hornhead, he wants the shield so badly he won't use this big monstrous minotaur. Effectively, won't use his shield. Won't use this club to crush the shield because he wants it. But again, it's part of the reason they went after them. And I love going back to the Daughters' War, and then you have after you read that, you have absolutely no question why she won't sell it or let it go.
Yeah, and there's something, I mean, I was thinking about that, and then the Thieves Guild, and then also the way that the mages treat the inferior mages, or the less powerful mages. There were all these different ways in which, like, the economics of power, or something pretentious sounding like that, I think is at play in this world. That if we can get you into the guild, sure, yeah, come, we'll teach you how to be a thief, no problem. That's great. Just sign right here. Oh, we're gonna have to expel you or suspend you because you're behind on your tuition. You can work for us and redeem it. You're not quite as powerful as the really powerful mages, and we kind of need you to serve as not quite, well, maybe cannon fodder in essence. So that there's a fascinating kind of economy, I guess, as I think about it in the book, where it's you have all these kind of structures of power that proliferate all over the place, and they're quite willing to use, and I don't know where you would get this example from, but they're quite willing to use whoever is on the bottom rungs of the ladder, as need be, to keep the top rungs of the ladder going.
Oh God, yeah. That just seems like how the world is made, and
Yeah.
it just reflects it. But I do love the idea that the Thieves Guild will come to you and say, "Come, be a thief, sign here." But there's a 2/3 chance that you are going to a straw farm.
Yeah, you're not going to the proper school, and even Kinch says at the beginning, well, I think I went to a real school. I'm not 100%.
Is
Not
there
100%.
is there another level he's unaware of?
Right. And there's something fascinating to the attention to detail in terms of the different weapons that the characters use. So it's not like, Galva has a particular kind of sword, right? And it's
Right.
adept for particular kinds of fighting.
Right.
And you're going to wear a particular kind of chainmail, let's say, if you're if you're traveling, as opposed to in heavy combat or whatever. That attention to detail, I thought that made it feel very real, because
Thanks.
you're in medieval Europe, let's say. Just, not everybody has the same kind of sword.
Kinch has two, as a good example of this. Kinch has two daggers. He's got one that's effectively like a Bowie knife,
Yeah.
And you got another one that is basically a rondelle dagger, and it's for piercing chainmail. It's got a triangular profile to it. And he'll talk about whether he's going to use a bodkin point arrow or a leaf blade arrow,
Right.
depending on whether it's hitting an armored or unarmored target. And that's just real. That's just what happens when you're living in when you're dealing with like a world that's using armor.
Right. You need your different kinds of weapons for your different kinds of situations.
Yeah, and I mean, the novel could have worked dramatically and otherwise without those points, but I like those points, and I write the book I want to read.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Ben that there is, like, I feel like a kind of more, it feels more like sword and sorcery, except a sword and sorcery in which the background is maybe more elaborately worked out and more carefully worked out. So, you're reading Conan and you're like, all right, so basically, we're in ancient Egypt now. Oh, okay, now these are basically Vikings, right? But there's no necessary consistency. Like, Howard doesn't really worry about how would these guys all exist in the same, more or less the same time and approximately the same place. Whereas I feel like what you've got going is you have, is he sort of Irish? Maybe, like, can you see him that way? Is Galva, I mean, is she Spanish? Is she, but there, what I thought was so impressive about both books was the sense in which these different cultures kind of fit together and cohabit the same kind of imaginative landscape, so that it doesn't feel as if you just drop them in. Sorry,
It's
Brad.
so vivid. Those details that you're talking about, John, they make the read so vivid. It's like where I was going through, it's like one chapter of Black Tongue Thief was just so packed full of ideas. I could see another author just using that for the whole book, and this just goes on and on. It's just a feast. It was glorious. All those details, they really made it pop off the page.
Thank you. John, you asked earlier if there were other things I wanted to write in this world, like, I've had short story ideas, and novella ideas in this world that I would like to pursue. I'll tell you one thing that I probably will pursue at some point. I hope I get to, is she's kind of a minor character. Okay, there's a trope in historical fiction and fantasy that we see a lot, and it is when you have somebody who decides they dislike the main character and they become the foil or the enemy of the main character, right? Like the Malfoy, right?
Right.
You read the historical novels of Ben Kane. You go back to ancient Rome. There's always some fucker who's like, I just don't like this person, and I'm going to go after him now.
Wasn't that Brutus? No.
Right. So I kind of did a nod to that in Daughter's War, because there is a character in there named Vega Charnat, and she's we talk about her being a boxer, and she does not like the Galva. She is not about the Galva, and she hates the fact that other people kowtow to her to some extent, both because of the meritocracy that is the Sword Academy, and she is just the best sword student,
Right.
but also the fact that she comes from real wealth. So Vega's not about that. And I want to write a short story or novella about Vega. I want to see what it's like to be a boxer, a poor boxer for money on the streets of Galimbor, one of the military cities of Ispanthia, and to have a wild Willy Wonka shot at being in this experimental unit where you're actually going to get paid decently, and maybe you're sending that money back to poor members of your family in dire circumstances, and maybe you've met members of this prestigious sword academy before and they've treated you like shit, and that's why you're predisposed not to like a Galva when you meet one,
Right.
because I don't like black and white.
Yeah.
I would love to flesh out her character and have it be a tragedy, when we see, spoiler alert, when we see her die, in Vega in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what, I mean, can you talk about, are you working on a new novel
Yeah.
in this and is it a sequel to The Black Tongue Thief? Is it Set
Yeah.
between Daughters War and Black Tongue Thief.
I've taken a little hiatus because my wife and I went to France for 3 weeks, and we just got back a week ago, a little more than a week ago, and now I'm doing book stuff. So I've not sat in front of the typewriter for the sequel for a good 6 weeks now, but I'm eager to. I'm ready to get back to it. But that is the project on my desk, and I'm about 30,000 words into it. So about a quarter, maybe 35. And it's slow going because there's a lot of again, there's a lot of world building in it because it's what Kinch and Galva discover over the thralls. Like it's not in Manreach. There are other things going on. There's another civilization we haven't met yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which is fun.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, but there will be a third book, and I think that third book's going to take place mostly in Ispanthia. And I think that one's going to go faster because I already have a lot of ideas about Ispanthia.
Uh-huh.
But yeah.
Good.
I wonder what it is that, and I'm gonna have to read these because it's not obviously not your average fantasy series, but I wonder. I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan, ironically, but what is it about fantasy? I wonder, guys, that is so enduringly popular to people. You know, I can't quite put my finger on it, but it is.
Escapism.
So yeah,
I don't think you have a pure kind of escapism. I mean, as a kid in the suburbs of St. Petersburg, Florida, in the late 70s and 80s, who was a nerd and who had skipped 2 grades and, you know, was dealing with just the very fairly conservative, not terribly cool people that you meet in high school
yeah.
in those worlds. Um, man, I couldn't wait to escape the torture chamber of high school and get to my D&D group. Couldn't wait to watch a fantasy movie. I remember when I first or fantastical history. I remember sitting around with a bunch of other nerds once I finally found the outlet of the Renaissance Festival that was nearby. I can't remember. I mean, I'll never forget meeting these people and thinking, oh my God, they're not mean to me, and they're smart and they're fun and they like history and they like things I like, and getting invited over to this one girl's house with a bunch of other people and sitting around watching Flesh and Blood, that old Rutger Hauer um, movie, which is so fun. I mean, it's got an unforgivable act of Deus Ex Machina in it toward the end, but otherwise a near perfect film in my book. Paul Verhoeven.
Yeah.
Yeah. A
Well,
lot of the same actors that were in Blade Runner are in minor roles in that. But yeah, fantasy, fantasy is not, I mean, it's not just escapism. It's also a good neutral vessel for other ideas. Like if you want to talk about slavery, or if you want to talk about war or about family or anything else, whatever, fantasy is a good thing that won't distract you with the real world while you're talking about your thing.
right. Even in your horror novels, that's in the quote unquote real world of the 60s and 70s. Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Talk about your Renaissance stuff that you do real quick.
Sure. I don't know if I can talk about it real quick, but
Well, however long
I'll
you want
give you
to
the
take.
quickest version I can. Yeah, I went to my first Ren fair at the age of 10. My dad took me to one in Florida, and I actually met a lot of people I would later work with, who were my elders in the business. As a teenager, I worked at a food booth at a Ren fair, and then as a late teenager, I became part of a sort of a volunteer group that did really bad stage combat in the human chess match at the fair. And, this was a bunch of people that, kind of bought swords wherever they could find them and came out and choreographed there with no experience or training of any kind. came out and choreographed fights with each other to try to look as real as they could. Read real fucking dangerous. And but it was fun, and the crowds loved it. It wasn't until I actually got cast in a cutting of Romeo and Juliet. I got to play Tybalt, and I was 25 years old. I met a dude who was playing Mercutio, and he was the fight choreographer, and he was in the Society of American Fight Directors. And he's the one, and he choreographed the fight and handed it to me, like with notation. And there was like notation for fights. But that was where I first learned, oh my God, there's a whole world of doing this choreography that is actually safe and historically informed. And I was fascinated, and I started going to workshops for that. And I eventually got, at the time they called it certified. They later called it recognized as an actor combatant.
Chris, are you familiar with the work of William Hobbs then?
Yes.
I got to say, those sword fights from the Three Musketeers,
The Duelists.
And Rob Roy, the guy is amazing.
Oh yeah, he's like the best of the best. I think he's the best choreographer I've seen work on film. So I know his work well. So yeah, I love stage combat choreography. Now that was only really a minor part of what I did the whole time. My entire 30-odd year career on the festival circuit, I did that a little bit for a little while and loved it. I talk about it more here because it had a disproportionate influence on my fantasy writing, because it actually ended up being very useful to me to have explored that stuff when I go to write fights now. But no, I came up with well, okay. They hired me when I was 20 years old to run the stocks. You put people in the pillories, and they were like, you just put them in there and you put a silly hat on them and you let them take a picture and they'll give you $1 and you can keep the $1. So that was the deal in 1989. But I wasn't content to just doing the silly hat. I started to talk to them and tell them why they were in there and kid them. And I began to like write routines around it. And pretty soon the gig wasn't, oh, get a picture taken. The gig became, oh, get this kid to like he'll ream you while you're in there. He'll insult you while you're in there. And so it wasn't just $1 anymore. Now I'd get a whole $5 to insult somebody, right?
Is that for you how the storytelling started, or was it before that as well?
I've always loved storytelling. I got my first Stephen King novel when I was 10, and I got stuck on a word, and I asked my dad what a prick was, and the novel, like magic, disappeared. And yeah, so I've always wanted to do this. I've always wanted to do this. Yeah.
And Mike usually pays a lot more to get reamed by somebody. Yeah.
Yeah. No, most people can't afford it. So
yeah. Curiously, as I got better and better at this, and I gravitated from being as a young guy on the lanes with a sign, I became a stage act, Christoph the Insulter, and then I would have assistants. They would go around and say, "Hey, you can get your friend insulted, but the more you pay him, the worse it is." And they'd make a list beforehand. So they'd start at 10, they'd get good at 20, and for 30, 40, or 50, they were awful. And I'd have like a 45-minute to an hour-long show where it was just nothing but going down the list. And then at the end of the list, I'd pick whoever had the most and make them the grand finale victim. And then I'd just take up a collection and let everybody else throw in too. So that insult would end up being this like $300 roasting. But
to the audience, who would be interested in a GoFundMe to pay Chris to do this to John Langan? I mean,
wow, that's Chris is like, now I'll do that one for free. Yeah.
I don't do pro bono. No.
Oh, nice. Okay. No. Okay.
And the mercenary factor is very important to my neutrality.
This is how
True.
pro wrestling started. I'm just throwing that out there. Like this is how like you start, someone's got to be the heel and the baby face. It's a work, learning how to insult properly, because if you tear your opponent down too much, it makes you look bad.
Yeah,
Because your
it's
opponent's too
interesting.
weak.
You
So you have
work
to
on
make them
that
look
on
good while tearing
pretty
them
much every
down.
conversation with me. You seem to be refining your skills at that, Ben. So
Wow, he's got
No,
a persecution complex, Ben. I tell you. Yeah.
hey, it's
but
reality.
you know what? You're not wrong about the about the understanding crowd dynamics aspect of this. Very, very important to know when you're losing your crowd, or to watch somebody try to heckle you back or be mean to their partner or whatever, and watch them lose the crowd, and know that you just got all kinds of currency, so that you can now really hit them and not lose the crowd.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Adjacent to this is that you've narrated several of your books. Suicide Motor Club, right? I'm going by memory here, and The Lesser Dead.
Yep.
And did you do those across the river? I can't remember.
I did not. No, that was a very talented actor named Paul Bramhall. Uh, he did a great job.
Well,
But
I often talk about audiobooks on this show, and
yeah,
a wonderful actor slash narrator can just take a great book, a book that's already great, and then now there's this added dimension to it.
yeah.
And so for those of you out there who enjoy audiobooks, it, The Lesser Dead, I just thought you did a wonderful job with The Lesser Dead and the Suicide Motor Club. And I
Did
listened
you
to a lot
do
of audiobooks.
did you do the Black Tongue Thief too, or?
I did.
Okay, yeah. I thought so, but I wasn't sure. What about the Daughters War?
No, no, it's female first person.
So right.
So it's the brilliant Spanish actress Nikki Garcia,
Hmm.
and she hasn't done. I don't think she's done that much work in English, but she's good. And
Yeah.
when she does occasionally hit a slightly linguistically off note, it actually tracks with the way I imagine the story being told, because I believe this is Galva finally opening up and telling Kinch her actual story at some point in the sequel. So she's speaking Holtish, but
Right.
English. So it should be accented.
Yeah.
And Nikki, I listened to a couple of other actors, maybe only one other actor, uh, when considering who's going to get the part. My Spanish translator for Between Two Fires, I went and I asked him, "Do you know any good voice actors in Spain?" And he was like, "Oh, Nikki Garcia." And he reached out to her. So I ended up listening to a track of her and a track of another young lady who was in, I think she's in Miami, but she was of Venezuelan extraction. And when I listened to her, she sounded like a very competent and good audio narrator. Like I'd totally hire her to do a normal audiobook. But Nikki Garcia sounds like she's cut a bitch. So there was no contest. When I heard them both, I was like, which one is the veteran who's done horrible things and had horrible things done to them? Nikki got that. She got it.
As someone, so I used to live in Los Angeles and I had to commute like 4 hours a day. And so audiobooks at the time was my main way of consuming these books. And so
yeah,
like one thing I did is like I went from like a Joe Abercrombie book to like a Brandon Sanderson book to a David Gemmell book to this, right? So that's a wide, I mean, we're talking the fantasy genre. That's a very mixed bag, right?
sure.
As far as like, Sanderson, I'm going to say is a more, let's call it lighter. I'm
Mhm.
not worse in any way, just softer, but like the quality of the readers and all of these things impacts you so badly because so obviously Sanderson is maybe one of the best paid authors currently in fantasy, if not the best paid. He's got like these amazing readers, and you need kind of that because there's other readers like Mike Davis has some favorites that maybe are former child actors that you listen to them read a book and you're like, oh, this isn't working. Like they have one voice and it's kind of
Really?
smug, and I'm not getting into these characters very much. And I'm not going to name any names because I know Mike is such a huge fan of these people. I don't want to disparage them, but so that quality of voice actor in an audiobook, people don't realize it. They think, oh, there's this big actor name on top of it. But it's like experienced narrators, experienced audiobook readers that really matters, especially with a story like this, where, like you talked about earlier, that verisimilitude, however you pronounce that word, it's the
Yeah, I
vodka
think
is
that's right.
affecting
Yeah.
my speech. It really affects how you get into that story. And if you feel distracted by the reader because they don't sound like they're into the story, you can't get into the story. And it really
Right.
breaks everything.
No, and you will not have that problem with Ms. Garcia. It's great. And on top of that, she's an incredibly gifted singer. And there's a song there's a couple of songs, but the one I'm thinking of is there's a point where the wizard says to Amiel, Galva's little youngest brother, like, I need you to sing the saddest song you know right now for this spell.
Oh no, but he put, what I love about the character is he's sarcastic, right? So he says, don't sing a sad song. Certainly the spirits wouldn't like it, which
The
means,
Mulrovans.
yeah, oh, it's so good.
That's culturally Mulrovan. They have this lie talk. Like you almost have to lie, as long as it's clear that you're lying. You don't like lie about important things. It's a very subtle thing, but as long as the circumstances clearly illustrate that this is a lie, then you say the lie.
It's one of those little details. That's why I say, like, this would make an amazing RPG setting, because that little detail there, that there's so many things I was thinking about, like, oh, this would be so great if you had this going on, or this or this. Those little tiny details, they just really, this isn't like a generic fantasy story. It's definitely higher fantasy than Between Two Fires, or more epic, I guess. I don't know what term to use, but those details, they pull that kind of, like, they pull you into the setting. It's so amazing to read it, and you can't, it's, I hate using the term feels real, because then they're also like casting a storm and like killing lambs and or an infant, depending on, you know, how they feel in the scene. Like, but there's so much about it that you read it and it feels like this could be a real thing, and it really pulls you in, and you're invested in these characters in the story.
Well, that's what I most wanted you to feel. So good.
Well, you succeeded. I do also want to comment that you mentioned that you should be able to read this without reading The Black Tongue Thief, which I read The Suicide Motor Club, which is probably the best vampire novel in the last 40 or 50 years. And then I've been on kind of like a high fantasy or epic fantasy kick, and it was like, oh, this book's coming out Tuesday. So I bought it Tuesday, not even knowing we were going to interview today, because I ignore Mike when he tells me things. And
I can vouch for that.
As
yeah,
well you
so I'm
should.
reading
Yeah.
it. It's like, oh my gosh, this book's amazing. And this is exactly what I was looking for. You know, like I said, going from Abercrombie to Gemmell to Sanderson, and then, you know, which is a great mix of all these authors, including yourself. And it's like, hey, this one's darker. This one's maybe a little bit more even. This one's lighter. And then we're back to darker. And maybe I'm gonna say darker than Abercrombie. Like, this is, maybe grimdark isn't my favorite description of things, but it's,
Oh, it's dark.
yeah, it's you're not getting Mistborn. I'm just gonna say that, like, which is not a bad thing. It's just a different thing.
But I've
And
also, oh, go ahead.
oh, I was just saying,
Yeah.
like, I love that. I love being able to go from like a Brandon Sanderson, like, kind of epic fantasy, very exciting. The magic is very clear, and then going to your story where it's like, hey, go get 3 lambs or an infant. I don't really care which, and something terrible is going to happen, but it's going to stop the goblins this one time. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is very different.
Yeah, no, it's dark. And I don't like unmitigated darkness. I mean, I intentionally leavened the darkness in Black Tongue with a humorous narrator. In this, I didn't have that, but I had an earnest narrator, and I had moments, I hope, of friendship and beauty and camaraderie. And the thing about Galva that you really don't know in Black Tongue, that you find out in Daughter's War, hopefully, is that she loves very deeply, but quietly. Like, she even says, toward the end, she's like, she has a thing where she says, I'm going to misquote myself, but it's like, I am not someone who needs to be loved as much as she loves, and I do not need to speak of this.
and I would say you even make that clear earlier, like in chapter 9, in Ascenta. I may be mispronouncing some of these names, so excuse me, because I was reading it. But there's she explains her relationship, and it's really poignant and kind of and very clear and well done, and maybe not in a way we expect from, especially in the culture we have with romantasy and it may be different genre, not to downplay the importance of romantasy and how wonderful it is for readers that enjoy it, but it's done in a very different way. I also think of the way Amiel, I believe is his name, the brother.
Amiel, yep.
He very much feels like I want to say a lighter character, and his letters that she's narrating, which at first I thought my ebook was broken because all of a sudden everything was in italics. It was like, oh, did the proofreader mess this up? But it's wonderful because the way he tells a story is much more light than she does. And you do get like kind of this more hopeful and kind of, he's like, oh, well, this, and then I love the way you the wizard has like a rabbit person that's like 2 feet tall, and the way they're described and the mix. And it's like, okay, this is not dark for the sake of being dark. This isn't like an 80s metal cover. This is very much like, there are pieces of hope. This is not a desolate, like terrible place, like The Road from Cormac McCarthy or something.
And that wizard's got a messed up sense of humor. He truly does. You meet him like Galva. You get a deeper dive on Fulvir in this book than you did, because you see him in Black Tongue Thief. You see him for a minute, and you get the Molrovan lying thing, like he's talking to Kinch and saying, "I am actually your father," but is he? Is he? You know, it seems for a minute he might be, or is he just Molrovan?
Yeah,
with him?
Is it his lying speech, right? Like,
yeah.
And there's something you mentioned at the very start when John was talking to you, and this idea of like you went from horror, fantasy to horror, and then back to fantasy. And there's something that reminds me of with like Stephen King, right? Like the reason we care about his horror is because we care about his characters. And Stephen King doesn't even call himself a horror writer. He thinks he's a science fiction fantasy writer. And I think you pull that off in these stories. You pulled it off in the vampire stories and other things too. But it very much does feel like in these stories, this is a horror fantasy novel. Like the goblins are not, this is not like Lord of the Rings. It's not even Goblin Slayer goblins, which are terrible in their own way. This is like they're alien monsters that see us as cattle.
Yes.
And how do you deal with that? But at the same time, like these characters, you feel what they're feeling, you experience what they're trying to experience. The way you explain why it's called the Daughters' War, why women are fighting in the war primarily and not men at this point, and why we should care about them. And even the way that Galva is thinking about her brothers, like both the brother that's the general that's good, the brother that's like the layabout, lazy, maybe more stereotypical noble character in a story. And yet she still loves him and cares about him and wants to show affection.
Tries to.
And again, these are real characters. And then all of a sudden I really care a lot about, is one of the birds going to bite off her finger because she petted it wrong, and how this goes.
I've been talking a lot about the details in this. In fantasy, you've got all this free reign, as you were talking about, to create these. You're creating all these different things. In the vampire novels, for example, in the Lesser Dead, they exist in the tunnels underneath New York City. And these are not things that you can just make up out of whole cloth. And how did you go about making that world so real? Is it just tons of research, or I imagine that's what it had to be.
Yes.
Yeah.
I research a lot. I
Yeah.
research. It's a job.
Yeah.
Especially for the historical ones. Those across the river. I mean, I consumed so much about World War I and about the Depression, and I looked at so many photos from Depression era South, and read so much of the literature of the time to try to get the dialogue right. But that was totally eclipsed by the reading I had to do for Between Two Fires, to go back to 14th century France and make it credible, and yet to research it enough that I knew what I was writing about and could write small things credibly. Well, I'm not talking about info dumps, because those are boring, and you've got to do those carefully. You've got to ration that shit with an eyedropper.
Yeah.
But to know it well enough that I just casually mention she's wearing her patents now so she doesn't get mud on her stockings or whatever, and move on. There's for stage combat, they would say there's roughly an hour. You want an hour of practice for every second of a fight. And there must be some similar formula for how much reading you're going to do for what is being said in a historical novel, if you're doing it right, if you're doing it in a way that's going to immerse people and not shock out of it anybody who may actually happen to know something about the time or the place.
Unlike Mike, I can't speak to the 1930s, but I will say, like in the Suicide Motors Club, for example, because one of the main characters is a nun, right? Like, and the way you talk about Catholicism in there, because that's something as a devout Catholic, I run into a lot. Like, it's used a lot in fiction, especially in vampire or exorcism novels and stuff.
Yep.
But it's very much a pop culture version that's not real. And if you're a Catholic, like 2 sentences into this, you're usually like, oh, could you have just like asked a priest or something, like a Catholic friend, just ask the questions? And you clearly did that. And so I do appreciate, because I wouldn't have been able to finish that book if that nun was written as like a
pop nun.
Yeah, it's like, okay, you clearly, you watched The Flying Nun, back in the 70s, great. That's not Catholicism, and now I'm completely out of this book and I can't follow it. And so I love the way you handled faith in that story, even, and how she's dealing with the loss she suffered, how her faith affects her now, how she keeps moving forward, how Catholicism factors into her faith versus like a general kind of understanding of the universe. It was really well done, and the research like shone through very clearly.
Thank you. It was important to me. And for as much as I am personally, I mean, I don't love labels, but the closest thing you could probably call me is an agnostic. For as much as I am that, I would not call myself an atheist. I don't feel that I have any knowledge one way or the other about what is or isn't out there or in us. For as much as I don't embrace any particular religious creed, I don't want to manhandle one either. I don't want to mishandle one either. So when I'm dealing with Catholicism, when I'm dealing with Judaism, when I'm dealing with any of that stuff, I want to treat it respectfully, and I want to know what I'm talking about.
And
all right, I'm back on the idea of the flying nun versus vampires. I just like to think about that. Okay, that's what we should get out of this conversation.
And
but if you're gonna have a flying nun, you got to at least give the vampires the power of flight, like in Lost Boys, so you
I don't know though, because you've only got
fights.
You've only got one flying nun, and you've got like however many vampires, right? I mean,
they've got the muscle,
that's all she's got.
But wouldn't you rather have the muscle car? I don't know. In Suicide Motor Club, that's Suicide Motor Club is set in '68, and if I remember correctly, The Lesser Dead is set in '78. Reading those, they do feel like that's exactly where they belong. But what led you to that decision for both of those novels?
Well, The Lesser Dead was first. So I'll tell you that the inspiration for that was I was thinking about the mole people, and I was fascinated by this idea that you could live down there in the dark. And this was an 80s, early 90s phenomenon chiefly.
Wait, are you talking about the old 60s movie, The Mole People?
No, I'm talking about the cultural phenomenon of communities of people who are sort of exiles, refugees, living down underneath the subway system in New York in the 80s and 90s, in which the one journalist famously went down there and sort of talked with these people and began to get, had sort of, I can't remember her name, but it was fascinating stuff. And I read all that stuff. But I got my wheels spinning like, well, this is sort of known from the 80s. What was happening in all that unused space before? And I thought, what a perfect place to be a vampire. You've got access to the subway system, so you can move around the boroughs at will. You never have to be exposed to sunlight. And I thought, Jesus Christ, this would be the most hotly contested real estate in vampire world, would be to be down there. So that was the spark of it. So, okay, we have 70s, we have vampires. what kind of vampires? And one of the first images I got, because sometimes it just comes to me in images. One of the first images I got was of an over made up child of about 6 or 7 years old, alone on a subway, looking at you from the other car.
Yeah,
And it kind of from there.
very creepy. And your decision to your narrator in The Lesser Dead is what, pushing 60 years old, but he looks what, 14, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, he was turned at 14.
But the very interesting thing to me is that emotionally, despite all the experience of 60 years emotionally, he seems to stay around 14 years old. And why did you make
Yeah.
that decision, and where did that come from? That's really different and interesting.
Yeah, I found it interesting too, because we've seen like Claudia
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
interview, right? We've seen, okay, I'm effectively a grown up in a child's body, but so much of our personality is linked to chemistry and physical phenomena in the body, and I thought, how much more interesting would it be if yes, you might get more knowledge as you get older, because certainly the younger people and people like, I mean, Joey's got a lot of facts that he knows about earlier times, but emotionally, yeah, he's still a teenager. And when you meet we're on the verge of spoilers. Are we doing spoilers here or no?
I would say keep them soft, because I don't think everyone out there has read the vampire books, and I really want them to.
Yeah. Read The Lesser Dead. Read The Lesser Dead. When you people get stuck wherever they are when they're turned. That's where they are. Yeah.
I had another question, but it just went out of my head. As Ben says, I'm very old. John, everybody, do you guys have any more questions for Chris?
No, this has been great. This has been
Yeah.
so fascinating. Can't
For
wait
me
for my
too.
I definitely do want to encourage this short story collection set in the Black Tongue Thief Daughters
Oh,
War
yeah, man.
world that
Sign
you've
me
already
up.
promised us here. Like, we have video evidence, so you can't back out now.
We're all pre-ordering the limited edition signed copy. So cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because like I said, I mean, Daughters War, and I want to encourage everyone to go pick this up. It just came out on Tuesday. It's unbelievable. And again, I'm coming from like other, quote unquote, big names in fantasy of different kinds, and being able to go to this and say like, oh my gosh, this version of goblins, it's fascinating. How the humans are fighting them, even the things the goblins did before the story starts to make it a more lopsided fight where the humans are at a disadvantage. And I don't know, I don't want to spoil too much of the book, because I want people to go and read this thing. The way the characters are written, the way the magic is done, it's something we haven't seen in fantasy in a very long time, I feel like. So I really enjoy this book. I really want to encourage everyone to go pick it up.
Thanks.
I'm actually surprised to hear that the vampire novels did not do as well as they could, and I hope that they get a second moment, because these really are two of the most unique vampire novels I've ever read. So sorry,
Thanks.
John.
Yeah.
You were gonna
Yeah, I
say
mean,
something?
I'm not gonna lie. I'm still hoping for whatever comes after the Suicide Motor Club. I'm still.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't, like, I can totally see, artistically speaking, just leaving it there, just saying, no, you got this little fragment of this group of people, and this is what they were doing, and there you go. But I'd love to pick up the story in 1988, or so 20 years later or something like that, which I get that, there were commercial challenges there, and that sort of stuff. And I'm just as excited for more in the world of the Black Tongue Thief and the Daughters War.
So I'm just going to say, if you read Catherine Addison's The Goblin Emperor.
Oh yeah, that's good.
Then you should read The Black Tongue Thief, and then you can sue for whiplash.
Very different goblins.
Oh,
Very
man.
different goblins. Yeah.
But that's
Yeah,
one of the great, going back to what Mike was saying, that's one of the great things about fantasy is you're allowed to do something different, because it's not real. There's not a real goblin empire out there for you to offend when you reinterpret it in a different way. So you like the Horde Law was such a wonderful concept. Wonderful, maybe not the correct word, but you know, amazing
horrible, wonderful. Yeah.
concept. Yes. So yeah,
For readers, to tell you what that was about, there were human cities that were captured, and it isn't like the goblins just went in there and immediately butchered and smoked everyone. They would put a city under horde law, so they're effectively captive, and they would demand a certain tithe of meat, effectively people, from them. But also, everyone upon reaching puberty had to have a tendon, the tendon of the tendons out, the outer tendons of their thighs cut, um, which is an injury you can recover from to walk and perhaps farm and do things like this, but you're not going to run after that. You're not going to jump after that, so you're not going to be an effective soldier, really. Yeah, brutal. So
That is.
yeah.
I remember what I wanted to ask you to tell the audience. I believe I read. Yeah, I know I read the Suicide Motor Club first. And the hook that really got me, the description, was what these vampires were doing in the late 70s, or excuse me, in the late 60s, in 1968.
How
On
they
these,
hunted?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that just real quick before we let you go?
Yeah, the Suicide Motor Club. Yeah, The Lesser Dead is a little better known. The Lesser Dead, a lot more people have read it. Suicide Motor Club is probably between that and The Necromancer's House. Those are the most overlooked of the books. But in Suicide Motor Club, part of the reason they have that name is because there's a group of vampires, about 5 of them, and what they've done is they're motorheads. They've got these muscle cars, and they'll get out there and cause accidents in the middle of the night on rural highways.
Yeah, middle of nowhere,
Middle
dead
of
of
nowhere.
night.
And they won't use their fangs. They will use glass and metal from the accident to cut you open and drink you. There's actually this is a content warning, graphic thing coming. I'll count to 5 and I'll say it. There's a scene where somebody's been very badly injured, and they're on sort of on the um, hood of the car, and one of them pulls off one of the windshield wipers and squeegees down the blood
Right.
over the hood and drinks that down. And if you think about it, they're not leaving any evidence that looks like anything other, except for maybe that mark. They're not mostly not leaving evidence that looks like anything other than an accident. There's nothing vampiric looking about this stuff. So, and they travel so far, so fast. They're 5 states away, by the time the wreck is found.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what got me reading the book. It's pretty unique. And yeah, I hope everyone listening, if you haven't read those, that you buy them and do so. Any other questions? John, thank you for doing this. Ben,
No, I
Matt,
think
everyone.
you have to thank Ben, because Ben just swooped in there and just completely deposed the deposer, and Ben was just like, out of my way, old man, and it was, I don't even know what happened there.
Awesome.
Yeah, no, Ben was he was the MVP.
Yeah.
I want everyone to go read these books because they really are like I said, I was reading the book and then I see the email from Mike like, hey, we're interviewing Christopher Buehlman, and it was like, oh, what a coincidence. Let's do this.
Synergy.
It's
Nice.
There's really, everyone should go read this. It's really, really amazing. And you're not gonna find a lot out there that kind of goes in the direction this does. It's really wonderful. I know the Black Tongue Thief was well received, at least by a lot of the community. I really think this kind of even out, hopefully will outdo it. It's so good.
I do think whether you're reading horror or obviously, as you guys have been talking about, the fantasy, the thing to think about Chris as a writer is when you're reading his stuff, you're really going to be there. You're there. I remember once I was reading the Suicide Motor Club for the first time, and I was reading it, and then I was up in the middle of the night, and I can't remember, but there's this scene where the vampires are arriving at this guy's house, or vampires arriving at this guy's house to do him in for some reason. I have to reread the book. And I'm reading it in the middle of the night. It's the middle of the night in the book, and it just felt so real.
Mm.
And yeah, whatever you're reading of Chris's, that's the feeling you're going to get. So
Yeah, absolutely. I would second that very heartily.
Jumps off the page. You're there.
yeah,
Ah, thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
and I can really see, I hope it happens at some point. Some a Netflix series or a Amazon Prime series with either or both.
Do you know about the podcast? Did I tell you about the podcast?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Last time you were on, you told us about it. Talk about that. It's the Lesser Dead podcast.
Yeah, this was sort of fruit of the COVID panic. I was approached by a producer and a friend who had wanted to do The Lesser Dead for television way back in 2015 and had spent some blood and sweat and treasure trying to get that done. It didn't get done. But then he moved over to podcast world and a company called Echoverse, and they hired me to write The Lesser Dead as a fiction podcast, and I wrote all 8 episodes of the first season. And because it isn't a big time suck for actors to do just voice, we were able to get some banging actors. We got Minnie Driver playing Margaret McManus,
Wow.
and yeah, oh my God. And as good as you think she's going to be at it, she's exponentially better. I mean, the performance is stunningly good. And you've got Jack Kilmer, Val Kilmer's kid, playing Joey, and you've got Danny Houston playing the Hessian. Fun fact, and this was not done on purpose. Trivia, deep dive trivia. Danny Houston, playing a vampire in this, says the same line he says as a vampire in 30 Days of Night. He just says there's a moment where he says there is no God. It was like, oh shit, he says exactly that line in 30 Days of Night. Fuck.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely forgot about that. I've got to give that a re-listen.
Saul
was
Rubinik's in it.
amazing.
Yeah.
Sorry, say that
Saul
again.
Rubinik plays Svetko.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, check that out too, folks. It's
Very proud.
serves. It's on Apple, Spotify, other places. So
Anywhere you get podcasts, yeah, it is a completely overlooked fucking gem. I couldn't be prouder of it. It's a really, really good audioscape, everything about it. The music, they paid some money for needle drops. They've got some really good music on that. It's worth your time.
I've said this often on the show, but I'm a huge fan of audio drama. I got into it as a kid, listening to
in the 30s.
Yes, in the 30s.
In the 30s, The Shadow was on. You were like, Orson Welles, here we go.
Yes.
Such a
you all. There's reasons
Is
I
it
don't
true
mind
you
jokes.
fell for the whole night of the Martian invasion thing? Is that?
I did
I
not.
didn't
Everyone
hear
else
it. That
did,
was
though.
funny. They're not funny because Mike's younger than me. Okay.
Well,
I didn't want to be the one to bring that up, Matt, but you remain a vampire at the age at which you were turned. So,
Well, I guess my point is it was the 80s, and this radio station in Des Moines, they would play what they called the golden age of radio theater, and they would at 10:30 every night they would do a half hour of whatever and another half hour of whatever, all kinds, comedy, drama, horror, whatever. And that's how I got into it. And then now we're in a kind of a golden age of radio theater again with podcasting and shows like the Lesser Dead. And I wish I had in front of me, but Vincent Price did a show called The Price of Fear in the 70s, another audio drama, and you can listen to it for free online. It is amazing to listen to, and I got the book from it too, and he introduces it. I wish I had it in front of me because I definitely won't do it justice. But in the introduction, he talks about all his in every medium of storytelling. He preferred audio drama to everything, to film, to books, to everything else. And I just thought that was so interesting, especially for a guy who's done so much film.
Didn't more recently, didn't Sarah Gran write an audio drama? She wrote a fantastic possession novel called Come Closer, which is
It's so good.
yeah, which is just
It's
like a
so good.
classic. And
Yeah.
she's written other brilliant stuff too, but I feel pretty sure I have in some wish list somewhere on social media, you know, Amazon, whatever, a podcast series that she scripted. I have to look into that. But
Oh,
if so, that would absolutely be worth checking out.
if you find that out, will you message me?
Yeah, sure,
ditto,
I wanna-
John.
I-
I want to check that out
He'll
too.
show you. He'll show
Yeah.
you during the kidnapping.
Well,
I'll be
yeah,
like, come into this van, Chris Buehlman. I've got Sarah Gran's podcast in here. And he'll be like, Sarah Gran.
I'll be like, officer, I'm being harassed by Ewok bubbles.
well, Chris, this has been really great. Thank you for doing this.
You guys have been fantastic, John. All of you guys, Mike. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Really fun
Thank you.
talking with you guys.
Thank you for the books, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait to see what's next. And I'm 100% with John that if you ever feel moved to do another vampire novel, I hope that you do. You know, Ben said Suicide Motor Club, I think you said, or was it The Lesser Dead? They're both fantastic. In his view, the best vampire novel of the last 40 years. And they really are amazing. So
Thanks.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. If you haven't read them, you need to.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, yeah. Thanks everyone. John, I want to thank you for a gift to my Patreons. You told me a while ago that I could have somebody record the novella Anchor, which you wrote for me first for Autumn Cthulhu back in 2016, something like that. And it's also in your collection. Which collection is it?
Corpse Mouth,
Right.
the most recent one, yeah.
Right. Anyway, John Paget recorded that.
And did a bang up job. Yeah.
Yeah. He's an absolute, speaking of narrating, he's an absolutely fantastic narrator. And this is almost 3 full hours of John, probably in my top 5 favorite novellas of all time. And he's,
well, thank you.
Yeah, he's performing that. And if you're a $10 and up Patreon, then that's one of your newest benefits. So, John, thank you for that gift, and thanks to John Paget
thank
if you're
you.
out there listening. So,
John on John.
John and John did fantastic on that. Yeah. So the other thing is Necromancer's House. I noticed like 3 days ago. I'm like, what the fuck is this? It went so completely. I'm a fan of yours, and it went so completely under my radar that I didn't know it even existed. So I just started it. So yeah, it's on Kindle Unlimited, I believe, and if you got an Audible account, it's free as well. So
have you? So you've started it, but you haven't finished it yet.
No, I just started it. I just got it the other day. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a wild one.
Yeah. Well, it's quite the hook. You want well, before you go, you want to tell people what it's about?
Yeah, the Necromancer's House is the only contemporary thing I've actually written. It's
right, which is interesting to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote it in 2013. It's set in 2012. And it's about a modern day wizard who's in Alcoholics Anonymous, and his best friends are also in recovery. And one of them is an aspiring witch because he discovers she's got the aptitude. But this is a guy who, when he was younger, went over to the Soviet Union at the time and looking for Slavic magic, which is particularly vicious and strong. And he ended up stumbling into Baba Yaga's
Oh, what?
domain.
You sold me. I'm sold. Okay.
Yeah. And he was captured by her and ended up escaping from her with some of her shit, including a hand of glory and books. And it has affected his whole life in that he's hid himself away in upstate New York in the woods with a house that's hidden and just hoping never to be discovered.
I told Chris, I was like, look, it's my story. I'm telling it to you, but for God's sake, don't share it with anybody. And then this comes out. I was just like, I'm
your
trying to
mistake.
hide in upstate New York. And I mean, son
And
of a
I'm-
bitch.
And then in the
And I'm feeding
synopsis, it's like, you thought you got away with this, we're coming for you, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. It's you know what? It was probably my experience dealing with magic in this book that helped whet my appetite for fantasy, because I was really able to deal with some wild spells that these guys get involved with. Because you will see battles between mages, between wizards and witches, happening in the modern day. One of them happens over the internet, and it's particularly brutal. But yeah, it's a fun ride, and I wrote it third person, present tense, so it's got a little more of a rapid fire feel to it, and some people don't like that, but I do. It was right for that book.
Well, I remember that. Let's see here. I'm looking at the description now. Now a monster straight from the pages of Russian folklore is coming from him, and frost and death are coming with her. Yeah, I can't find it right now, but talking about, wasn't they use the internet to do magic as at some points as well? What you just said.
Yeah, there is one witch who lives in Chicago, and her name is Rada, and she is sort of his tech go-to person, and she's able to do things like magically hack into satellites, to like military satellites, to find things because they're looking for Baba Yaga. But she ends up tangling with one of Baba Yaga's agents online in a fight, and it's fucking brutal. Yeah.
This is what I was trying to find. He's able to speak through speak with the dead through film.
Mm-hmm.
Just throwaway line in the description. I was like, oh wow,
Yeah, but
nothing I've ever heard of.
But it only works for him with VHS. So
At least it's not Betamax.
True.
So if you bring him a VHS of your grandpa or whatever, he can open up a loophole in that, a trap door in that, and let you talk to them. Yeah.
That's cool. Well, this has been great. I really appreciate you doing this, and John and everybody, thanks for being here as well. So
Anytime.
yeah, looking forward to what you have next, Chris. And it's The Daughters of War. Pick it up, and see you next time, everybody.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys. Good